Good morning, everyone, everywhere, and special greetings to all those seated in heavenly places in Jesus. We are going through the history of Protestantism at this moment, and we're going to jump right in and pick up where we left off last time. We have come to Chapter 9 of Book 7. Protestantism in England from the times of Wickliffe to Henry VIII. So we are in Chapter 9, Rome's attempt to regain dominancy in England. Henry VI, his infancy, distractions of the nation. The Romish Church becomes more intolerant. New festival. St. Dunstan's and St. George's Day. Indulgences at the shrine of St. Edmund, etc. Fresh attempts by Rome to regain dominancy in England. What led to these? Statutes of Provisors and Praemunire. Denounced. Archbishop Chichely reprimanded for permitting these statutes to exist. The Pope's letter. Henry V, overtaken by death in the midst of his wars in a foreign land, left his throne, as we have seen, to his son, then only a few months old. England now experienced, in amplest measure, the woe predicted of the land whose child is a king. During the long minority, many evil fruits grew out of the counsel tendered to the king by the clergy. If ever country needed a firm will and a strong hand, it was England at the era that saw this infant placed on the throne. There were factions to be repressed, turbulent nobles to be curbed, conspirators, though the Lollards were not of the number to be hunted out and punished, and above all, there was the rising spirit of reform to be guided into the channel of peaceful progress, so that it might repair institutions without destroying them. But the power, the enlightenment, and the patriotism necessary for these were lacking, and all these elements of conflict, unregulated and uncontrolled, broke out and strove together in the now distracted and miserable country. The natural tendency of corruptions, when first approached by the pruning knife, is to strengthen themselves, to shoot up in new and ranker luxuriance, the better to resist the attacking forces. So it was with the Church of Rome at this era in England. On the one side, Lollardism had begun to question the truth of its doctrines. On the other, the lay power was assailing the utility of its vast possessions, and the Roman hierarchy, which had not made up its mind to yield to the call for reformation now addressed to it, had no alternative but to fortify itself against both the Lollards without and the cry for reform within. It became instantly more exacting in its homage and more stringent in its beliefs. Aforetime, a very considerable measure of freedom had been allowed to friend and foe on both points. If one was disposed to be witty, or satirical, or humorous at the expense of the Church or her servants, he might be so without running any great risk of being branded a heretic. Witness the stinging diatribes and biting satires of Petrarch, written, we may say, under the very roof of the popes at Avignon. But now the wind set in from another quarter, and if one spoke irreverently of saint, or indulged in a quiet laugh at a monk, or hinted a doubt at any miracle or mystery of Holy Church, he drew upon himself the suspicion of heresy, and was fortunate indeed if he escaped the penalties thereto annexed. Some there were who aimed only at being wits, who found to their dismay that they were near becoming martyrs. Protestantism, which has only one object of worship, has only one great festival, that day which stands in majesty unapproachable among the other days. But the feasts and festivals of Rome crowded the calendar, and if more should be added to the list, it would be almost necessary that more days should be added to the year. Yet now there came a great addition to these days of unholy idleness. The previous century had enriched the Roman ceremonial with All Souls, the Conception of the Blessed Virgin, and Corpus Christi. To these Boniface IX had added the Salutation of Mary and Elizabeth, cram full of indulgences, as Walsingham says, for those who should duly honor the feast. Treading in the footsteps of the pontiff, although at a becoming distance, Archbishop Arundel contributed his share to this department of the nation's piety by raising St. Dunstan's and St. George's days to the rank of the greater festivals. Next came the monks of Bury, in this pious work of enriching England with sacred days and holy places. They procured special indulgences for the shrine of St. Edmund, nor were the monks of Ely and Norwich behind their brethren of Bury. They were enabled to offer full absolution to all who should come and confess themselves in their churches in Trinity Week. Even the bloody field of Agincourt was made to do its part in augmenting the nation's spiritual wealth. From October 25th, this day began to be observed as a greater festival, and, not to multiply instances, the canons of St. Bartholomew near Smithfield, where the fires of martyrdom were blazing, were diligently exercising their new privilege of pardoning all sorts of persons all manner of sins, except one sin only, the unpardonable one of heresy. The staple of the trade now being so industriously driven was pardon. The material cost nothing, the demand was extensive, the price was good, and the profits were correspondingly large. This multiplication of festivals was Rome's remedy for the growing irreverence of the age. It was the only means she knew of heightening the spirit of devotion among her members and strengthening the national religion. It was at this time that Pope Martin V of the haughty house of Colonna, who was elevated to the papal chair by the Council of Constance, which place he soon thereafter left for Rome in a blaze of magnificence, turned his eyes on England, thinking to put it as completely under his feet as it had been under those of Innocent III in the days of King John. The statutes of provisors and praemunire, passed in the reigns of Edward III and Richard II, were heavy blows to the papal power in England. The popes had never acquiesced in this state of matters, nor relinquished the hope of being able to compel Parliament to cancel these execrable statutes. But the calamities of the popedom, and more especially the schism, which lasted 40 years, delayed the prosecution of the fixed determination of the papal see. Now, however, the schism was healed. A prince, immature in years and weak in mind, occupied the throne of England. The nation had a war with France upon its hands. Factions and conspiracies were weakening the country at home, and success was ceasing to gild its arms abroad, or so the Pope thought, the time ripe for advancing anew his claim for supremacy over England. His demand was, in short, that the statutes of provisors and praemunire, which had shut out his briefs and bulls, his bishops and legates, and had cut off the outflow of English gold, so much prized at Rome, should be repealed. This request Pope Martin did not send directly to the king or the regent. The Vatican in such cases commonly acts through its spiritual machinery. In the first place, the pontiff is too exalted above other monarchs to make suit in person to them, and in the second place, he is too politic to do so. It lessens the humiliation of a rebuff, that it be given to the servant and not the master. Pope Martin wrote to Archbishop Chichely, frowning right pontifically upon him for a state of things which Cicely could no more prevent than Martin himself could. Martin, bishop, servant of the servants of God, began the pontiff. It is the usual papal phraseology, especially when some arrogant demand is to follow. To his reverend brother, the Archbishop of Canterbury, greeting and apostolic benediction. So far, well, but the sweetness exhales in the first sentence. The brotherly kindness of papal benediction is soon exhausted, and then comes the papal displeasure. Pope Martin goes on to accuse his reverend brother of forgetting what strict account he had to give to Almighty God of the flock committed to his care. He upbraids him as sleepy and negligent. Otherwise he would have opposed to the utmost of his power those who had made a sacrilegious invasion upon the privileges settled by our Savior upon the Roman Church, the statutes of provisors and praemunire, to wit. While Archbishop Cecily was slumbering, his flock, alas, the Pope tells him, were running down a precipice before his face. The flock, in the act of hurling themselves over a precipice, are seen, in the next sentence, feeding quietly beside their shepherd. For the Pope immediately continues, "You suffer them to feed upon dangerous plants without warning, and, which is horribly surprising, you seem to put poison in their mouths with your own hands." He had forgotten that Archbishop Cicely's hands were at that moment folded in sleep, and that he was now uttering a cry to awaken him. But again the scene suddenly shifts, and the papal pencil displays a new picture to our bewildered sight. For, adds the writer, you can look on and see the wolves scatter and pull them in pieces, and, like a dumb dog, not so much as bark upon the occasion. After the rhetoric comes a little business. What abominable violence has been let loose upon your province? I leave it to yourself to consider. Pray, peruse that royal law. The Pope now comes to the point. If there's anything that is either law or royal belonging to it. For how can that be called a statute which repeals the laws of God and the Church? I desire to know, Reverend Brother, whether you, who are a Catholic bishop, can think it reasonable that such an act as this should be in force in a Christian country. Not content with having exhibited the statute of praemunire under the three similitudes of a precipice, poison, and wolves, Pope Martin goes on thus. Under color of this execrable statute, the King of England reaches into the spiritual jurisdiction, and governs so fully in ecclesiastical matters, as if our Saviour had constituted him his vicar. He makes laws for the Church, as if the keys of the kingdom of heaven were put into his hands. Besides this hideous encroachment, he has enacted, continues the Pope, several terrible penalties against the clergy. This is rigor worse, the Pope calls it, than any which Jew or Turk was subjected, was the exclusion from the kingdom of those Italians and others whom the Pope had nominated to English livings without the king's consent, and in defiance of the statute. Was ever, asked the Pope, such iniquity as this passed into law? Can that be styled a Catholic kingdom where such profane laws are made and practiced, where St. Peter's successor is not allowed to execute our Saviour's commission? For this act will not allow St. Peter See to proceed in the functions of government, nor make provisions suitable to the necessities of the Church. Is this, asked the Pope, in fine, a Catholic statute? Or can it be endured without dishonor to our Savior, without a breach upon the laws of the gospel, and the ruin of people's souls? Why, therefore, did you not cry aloud? Why did you not lift up your voice like a trumpet? Show your people their transgressions, and the house of Jacob their sins, that their blood may not be required at your hands. Such were the terms in which Pope Martin deemed it becoming to speak of the act by which the Parliament prohibited foreigners, many of whom did not know our tongue, and some of whom, too lazy to come in person, sent their cooks and butlers to do duty for them, holding livings in England. He rates the Senate of a great nation as if it was a chapter of friars or a corps of papal pensioners, who dared not meet until he had given them leave, nor transact the least piece of business until he had first ascertained whether it was agreeable to his pontifical pleasure. And the primate, the very man who at that moment was enacting new edicts against heresy, deeming the old not severe enough, and was burning Lollards for the greater glory of the Church, he indecently scolds as grossly and traitorously negligent of the interests of the Papal See. This sharp reprimand was followed by an order to the Archbishop, under pain of excommunication, instantly to repair the Privy Council, and to exert his utmost influence to have the statute repealed. And he was further enjoined, as soon as Parliament should sit, to apply it for the same purpose, and to tell the Lords and Commons of England from the Pope that all who obeyed that statute were under excommunication. The primate was further required to charge all the clergy to preach the same doctrine, and lastly, he was ordered to take 2 grave personages with him to attest his diligence, and to certify the Pope of the result of the matter. Chapter 10. Resistance to Papal Encroachments. Embroilment of the Papacy. Why angry with Archbishop Chichely? A former offense. Advises the king not to receive a legate latere. Powers of the legate. Promise exacted of legate Beaufort. Pope's displeasure. Holds the statutes void. Commands the Archbishop to disobey them. Pope's letter to Duke Bedford. Chichely advises Parliament to repeal the act. Parliament refuses. The Pope resumes his encroachments. 2 currents in England in the 15th century, both radically Protestant. The evangelic principle, the master spring of all activities then beginning in society. Why this explosion of papal wrath against the primate of England? Why this torrent of abusive epithets and violent accusations, even granting the act of praemunire to have been the atrociously wicked thing the Pope held it to be, the very acme of rebellion against God, against St. Peter, and against the one whom the Pope seemed to think greater than either, himself? Could Archbishop Chichely have prevented the passing of it? It was passed before his time. And why, we may ask, was this tempest reserved for the head of Archbishop Chichely? Why was not the See of Canterbury taxed with cowardice and prevarication before now? Why were not Courtenay and Arundel reprimanded upon the same score? Why had the Pope held his peace until this time? The flock in England for half a century had been suffering the terrible scourge of being driven over a precipice, of being poisoned, of being torn by wolves, and yet the pontiff had not broken silence or uttered a cry of warning all that time. The chief shepherd had been slumbering as well as the under-shepherd, and ought first to have made confession of his own faults before so sharply calling others to a reckoning for theirs. Why was this? We have already hinted at the reasons. The affairs of the Papal See were in great confusion. The schism was in its vigor. There were at times 3 claimants of St. Peter's chair. While matters were so embroiled, it would have been the height of imprudence to have ruffled the English bishops. It might have sent them over to a rival interest. But now Martin had borne down all competitors. He had climbed to the sole occupancy of the papal throne, and he will let both the English Parliament and the English primate know that he is Pope. But Chichely had offended in another point, and though the Pope does not mention it, it is possible that it wounded his pride just as deeply as the other. The Archbishop, in his first convocation, had moved the annulling of the papal exemptions in favor of those under age. This he did, says Walsingham, to show his spirit. This was an act of boldness which the court of Rome was not likely to pardon. But further, the Archbishop brought himself into yet deeper disfavor by counseling Henry V to refuse admission to the Bishop of Winchester as legate a latere. The Pope could not but deem this a special affront. Chichely showed the king that this commission of legate a latere might prove of dangerous consequence to the realm, that it appeared from history and ancient records that no legates a latere had been sent into England unless upon a very great occasion, that before they were admitted they were brought under articles and limited in the exercise of their character, their commission likewise determined within a year at farthest, whereas the Bishop of Winchester was granted for life. Still further to convince the king of the danger of freely admitting such a functionary, he showed him canon law with the vast jurisdiction with which he was vested, that from the moment the legate entered, he, Henry, would be but half a king, that the legate a latere was the Pope in all but name, that he would bring with him the Pope's power in all its plenitude, that the chair of the legate would eclipse the throne of the king, that the courts of the legate would override the courts of Westminster Hall, that the legate would assume the administration of all the church property in the kingdom, that he would claim the right of adjudicating upon all causes in which, by any pretext, it could be made appear that the church had interest. In short, that the legate a latere would divide the allegiance of the subjects between the English crown and the Roman tiara, reserving the lion's share to his master. Henry V was not the man to fill the place of lieutenant while another was master in his kingdom. Winchester had to give way as the representative of Rome's majesty, the Pope's other self. He must not tread the English soil while Henry lived. But in the next reign, after a visit to Rome, the bishop returned in full investiture of the legate power. 1428, he intimated his commission to the young king and the Duke of Gloucester, who was regent, but he did not find the way as smooth as he had hoped. Richard Caudray, being named the king's deputy, met him with a protest in form that no legate from the Pope could enter the realm without the king's consent, that the King of England had long enjoyed this privilege, and that if Winchester intended to stretch his legatine authority to the breach of this ancient custom and enter of his own right, it was at his peril. The cardinal, finding the king firm, gave his solemn promise that he would do nothing to the prejudice of the prerogatives of the crown and the rights and privileges of the king. The spirit and patriotic conduct of Archbishop Chichely in advising that the legate a latere should not be recognized was the more honorable to him inasmuch as the man who in this case bore the legate commission was an Englishman and of the blood royal. It was rare indeed that any but an Italian was appointed to an office that came so near equally in its influence and dignity with the papal chair itself. The primate's conduct in the matter was doubtless reported at Rome. It must have been especially offensive to a court which held it as a maxim that to love one's country is to hate one's church. But the Vatican could not show its displeasure or venture on resenting the indignity while the warlike Henry V occupied the throne. Now, however, the silent Isles of Westminster had received him. The office was remembered, and the kingdom from whom it had come must be taught how heinous it is to humiliate the See of Rome, or encroach upon the regalities of St. Peter. The affair of the legate à latere was but one in a long series of affronts. To avenge it was not enough. The Pope must go further back and deeper down, and get at the root of that spirit of rebellion which had actuated England from the days of Edward III, and which had come to a head in the statutes of provisors and praemunire. We have seen the primate commanded to go to the Privy Council, and also to Parliament, and demand the repeal of these statutes. Excommunication was to be the penalty of refusal. But the Pope went in further. In virtue of his own supremacy, he made void these laws. He wrote to the archbishops of York and Canterbury, for the Pope names York before Canterbury, as if he meant to mortify the latter, commanding them to give no obedience to the statutes of provisors and praemunire, that is, to offer no resistance to English causes being carried for the adjudication to the courts of Rome, or to the appointment of foreigners to English livings, and the transport beyond the sea of their revenues, and declaring that should they themselves or any others submit to these laws, they would ipso facto be excommunicated and denied absolution, except at the point of death, and from the Pope himself. About the same time, the Pope pronounced a censure upon the Archbishop, and it serves to illustrate the jealousy with which the encroachment of the Vatican were watched by the English sovereign and his council, to find the primate complaining to the Pope that he could not be informed of the sentence in the regular way, that he knew it only by report, for he had not so much as opened the bulls that contained the censure, because he was commanded by the king to bring these instruments, with the seals whole, and lodge them in the paper office until the Parliament sat. The Pope did not rest with enjoining the clergy to hold the obnoxious statutes null and void. He took the extraordinary step of writing 4 letters, 2 to the king, 1 to the Parliament, and another to the Duke of Bedford, then Regent of France, urging and commanding them, as they valued the salvation of their souls, to repeal the Act of Praemunire. The Pope's letter to the Duke of Bedford is a specimen of the spirit that animated the popedom under Martin V. It is fair to state, however, that the Pope at that moment had received a special provocation which explains so far, if it does not excuse, the heat of his language. His nuncio had been lately imprisoned in England for delivering his briefs and letters. It may be supposed, though the bull does not acknowledge it, that they contained matter prejudicial to the crown. The Pope in his letter to the Duke of Bedford appears to strike only at the Act of Praemunire, but he does so with all his might. He calls it an execrable statute, that was contrary to all reason and religion, that in pursuance of this act the laws of nations and the privilege of ambassadors were violated, and his nuncios, much more coarsely used in a Christian country than those of that character among Saracens and Turks, that it was a hideous reproach to the English to fall thus short of infidels in justice and humanity, and that, without speedy reformation, it was to be feared some heavy judgment would be drawn down upon them. He concludes by desiring the Duke of Bedford to use his interest to wipe off the imputation from the government, to retrieve the honor of the Church, and chain up the rigor of these persecuting statutes. It is an old trick of Rome to raise the cry of persecution, and to demand justice whenever England has withstood her encroachments, and tried to bind up her hands from meddling with the gold or violating the laws of the nation. When Parliament assembled, the 2 archbishops, Canterbury and York, accompanied by several bishops and abbots, presented themselves in the refectory of the Abbey of Westminster, where the Commons were sitting, and, premising that they intended nothing to the prejudice of the King's prerogative or the integrity of the Constitution, they craved Parliament to satisfy the Pope by repealing the Act of Praemunire. Sicily had begun to quail before the storm gathering at Rome. Happily, the commons were more jealous of the nation's honor and independence than the hierarchy. Rejecting the archbishop's advice to serve two masters, they refused to repeal the act. The Pope, notwithstanding that he had been balked in his attempts to bend the Parliament of England to his will, continued his aggressions upon the privileges of the English Church. He sustained himself its chief bishop. He conducted himself as if the Act of Praemunire did not exist, paying no respect to the right of the chapters to elect and the power of the king to grant his congé d'élire. He issued his provisors appointing to vacant livings, not on the ground of piety or learning, but of riches and interest. The highest price in the market of Rome commanded the benefice. Pope Martin V, on the termination of the Council of Constance, promoted not less than 14 persons to various bishoprics in the province of Canterbury alone. The Pope empowered his favorites to hold sees in commendam, that is, to draw their temporalities, while another discharged the duty, or professed to do so. Pope Eugene IV, 1438, gave the bishopric of Ely in commendam to the Archbishop of Rouen, and after some resistance, this Frenchman was allowed to enjoy the revenues. He ventured on other stretches of his supremacy in the matter of pluralities of non-residents and of exemptions in favor of minors, as the holders of ecclesiastical livings. We find the Pope further issuing bulls empowering his nuncios to impose taxes upon the clergy and collect money. We trace, in short, in the ecclesiastical annals of the time, a steady and persistent effort on the one side to encroach, and a tolerably steady and continuous effort on the other to repeal. Henry Edward Manning, Archdeacon of Chichester, with strict historical truth says, "History, he will see a standing contest between the rulers of this land and the Bishop of Rome. The Crown and Church of England, with a steady opposition, resisted the entrance and encroachment of the secularized power of the Pope in England. From the days of King John, the shadow of the Vatican had begun to go back on England. It was still shortening in the 15th century, and its lessening line gave promise of a time for the advent of which the good Lord Cobham had expressed an ardent wish, when that ominous penumbra, terminating at Calais, would no longer be projected across the sea to the English shore." While the English monarchs were fighting against the papal supremacy with the one hand, they were persecuting Lollardism with the other. At the very time that they were framing such acts as those of provisors and praemunire to defend the canons of the Church and the constitutions of the state from the utter demolition with which both were threatened from a foreign tyranny, they were enacting edicts for the conviction of Lollards and planting stakes to burn them. This does not surprise us. It is ever so in the earliest stages of a great reform. The good which has begun to stir in the quiet dearth below sends the evil to the surface in quickened activity. Hence the contradictions as that before us. To a casual eye, matters appear to be getting worse, whereas the very effervescence and violence of the old power is a sign that the new are not far off, and that a reformation has already set in. The Jews have a proverb to this effect: "When the tale of bricks is doubled, then Moses will come," which saying, however, if it were more exactly to express the truth of the fact and the law of divine working, should run, "If the tale of bricks has been doubled, therefore Moses is come." We trace in the England of the 15th century two powerful currents, and both are, in a sense, Protestant. Lollardism, basing itself upon the Word of God and the rights of conscience, was essentially and wholly Protestant. The fight against the Roman supremacy, basing itself upon the canons of the Church and the laws of the kingdom, was also so far Protestant. It was a protest against a power that was lifting its seat above all and crushing every right. And what, we ask, engendered this spirit of opposition? Little did the party who were fighting against the supremacy dream whence their movement drew its existence. They would have been ashamed to own it, even if made aware of it. And yet it is true, the very Lollardism which they were seeking to trample out had originated the spirit that was now shown in defense of national independence and against the papal encroachments. The Lollard, or Protestant, or Christian principle, for it matters not by which one of these three names we designed it, had all along through the Dark Ages been present in the bosom of European Christendom, preserving to the conscience some measure of action and power, to the intellect some degree of energy and expansion, and to the soul the desire and the hope of liberty. Ordinarily, this principle attested its presence by the piety with which it nourished the heart, and the charity and purity with which it enriched the lives of individual men and women, scattered up and down in monasteries, or in cathedral chapters, or in rural vicarages, or in hidden places where history passed them by. At other times it forced itself to the surface, and revealed its power on a large scale, as in the Albigenses' revival. But the powers of evil were then too strong to permit of its keeping the footing it had momentarily obtained. Beaten down, it again became torpid. But in the great springtime which came along with Wickliffe, it was effectually roused, never again to slumber. Taking now its place in the front, it found itself supported by a host of agencies, of which itself was the real, although the indirect creator. For it was the Lollard or Christian spirit, never amid all the barbarism and strife and superstitions that overlaid medieval society, eliminated or purged out, that hailed letters in that early morning, that tasted their sweetness and prompted to the cultivation of them, that panted for a wider sphere, for a greater liberty, for a purer state of society, and never rested until it had achieved it. This despised principle, for in the 15th century it seemed at the bar of tribunals, in prisons, at stakes, in the guise of a felon, was in truth the originator of these activities. It commanded to them the first impulse. Without it they never would have been. Night, not morning, would have succeeded the Dark Ages. It was the dayspring to Christendom. And this is certified to us when tracing the course of the two contemporary currents which we find flowing in England in the century under review. We see them at a point a little way only in advance of that which we are now arrived, uniting their streams and forming one combined movement, known as the English Reformation. But before that point could be reached in England, it had to pass through a terrible conflict. Chapter 11. Influence of the Wars of the 15th Century on the Progress of Protestantism. Convulsions of the 15th Century. Fall of Constantinople. Wars in Bohemia, in Italy, in Spain, in Switzerland. Wars of the Papal Schism. Was it peace or war which the popes gave to Christendom? Wars originated by the popes. The Crusades, the War of Investitures, the Albigensian and Waldensian Crusades, the wars in Naples, Poland, and etc., the feuds in Italy, the Hussite campaigns, etc. War of the Roses, traced to the Council of Archbishop Chichely. Providential end of the wars of the 15th century. The nobility weakened. The throne made powerful. Why? Hussitism and Lollardism. The day that was hastening toward the world sent terrible tempests before it as the heralds of its approach. Other than the middle of the 15th century, there is perhaps no point in modern history that presents a scene of more universal turmoil and calamity except the period that witnessed the fall of the Western Empire. Nowhere is there stability or rest. All around, as far as the eye can reach, appears a sea whose waters, swollen into huge billows by the force of the mighty winds, are assailing the very foundations of the earth. The Christian of that day, when he cast his eyes round on a world rocked and tossed by these great tempests, must have despaired, had he not remembered that there was one who sits king upon the floods. The armies of the Turks were gathering round Constantinople, and the Queen of the East was about to bow her head and sink in a tempest of pillage, of rapine, and of slaughter. The land of Bohemia, watered, as with a plenteous rain, once again, and a third time, with German blood, was gloomy and silent. Germany had suffered far more than she had inflicted. From the Rhine to the Elbe, from the Black Forest to the Baltic, her nations were lamenting their youth slaughtered in the ill-fated campaigns into which Rome had drawn them against the Hussites. Italy, split up into principalities, was ceaselessly torn by the ambitions and feuds of its petty rulers, and if for a moment the din of these intestine strife was hushed, it was in presence of some foreign invader whom the beauty of that land had drawn with his armies across the Alps. The magnificent cities of Spain, adorned by the art and enriched by the industry of the Moors, were being emptied of their inhabitants by the crusade of bigotry. The Moslem flag was being torn down on the walls of Granada, and the race which had converted the Vega round the Moorish capital into a garden, watering it with the icy torrents of the Sierra Nevada, and clothing it with cornfields and orange groves, were fleeing across the straits to form new seats on the northern shores of Africa. The Swiss, who had looked for centuries with almost uninterrupted indifference on the wars and convulsions that distracted the nations that dwelt at the feet of their mountains, finding themselves in their great halls an impregnable fortress against invasion, now saw themselves menaced in their valleys with a foreign sword, and had to fight for their immemorial independence. They were assailed by the two powerful kingdoms on each side of them, for Austria and France, in their desire to enlarge their territories, had become forgetful that in leveling of the Alps of the Swiss, they but effaced the barrier between themselves, which prevented the two nations mingling their blood on fierce and frequent battlefields. As if the antipathies of race and the ambition of princes were not enough to afflict an unhappy age, another element of contention was imported into the strife by the papal schism. The rival popes and their supporters brought their case into the battlefield, and torrents of Christian blood were shed to determine the question of which was the true vicar. The argument from piety, from wisdom, from learning, were but dust in the balance against the unanswerable argument of the sword, and the gospel of peace was converted into a tocsin of war. The evils flowing from the schism, and which for so many years afflicted Christendom, cannot but raise the question in every dispassionate mind how far the popes have fulfilled the office assigned them as the fathers of Christendom and the peacemakers of the world, leaving out of view their adulators on the one side and their incriminators on the other. Let us put to history the question: how many are the years of peace? How many are the years of war which have come out of the papal chair? And what proportion does one bear to the other? To put, then, a few plain questions touching matters of fact, let us ask, from whom came the Crusades, which for 2 centuries continued to waste the treasure and blood of both Europe and Asia? History answers: from the popes. Monks preached the crusade. Monks enlisted soldiers to fight them. And when the host was marshalled and all was ready, monks placed themselves at their head, and led them onward, their track marked by devastation, to the shores of Syria, where their furious fanaticism exploded in scenes of yet greater devastation and horror. In these expeditions the popes were always the chiefs. The crossed emperors and kings were enlisted under their banner and put under the command of their legates. At the Pope's mandate, it was that they went forth to slay and to be slain. In the absence of these princes, the popes took into their hands the government of their kingdoms, the persons and goods, lavish distribution of indulgences and dispensations, to keep alive fanatical fervor and sanguinary zeal. They sometimes enjoined as a command, and sometimes as a penance, service in the crusades. Their nuncios and legates received the alms enjoined as a command, and sometimes as a penance, service in the crusades. Their nuncios and legates received the alms and legacies bequeathed for maintaining these wars. And when after 2 dismal centuries they came to an end, it was found that none save the popes were the gainers thereby. While the authority of the papal see was vastly strengthened, the secular princes were in the same proportion weakened and impoverished. The sway of Rome was confirmed, for the nation, broken and bowed down, suffered a yoke to be riveted upon their necks that could not be broken for ages. We must ask further, from whom came the contest between the mitre and the empire, the war of investitures, which divided and ravaged Christendom for a full century and a half? History answers. From the Pope. Gregory VII, from whom came the Albigensian Crusades, which swept in successive tempests of fire and blood across the south of France. History answers. From the Pope. Innocent III, whence came those armies and assassins which times without number penetrated into the Waldensian valleys, carrying the torch into dwelling and sanctuary, and inflicting on the unoffending inhabitants barbarities and cruelties of so horrible a nature that they never can be known, because they never dare be told? History answers. From the Pope. Who made donations of kingdoms? Naples, Sicily, Aragon, Poland, and others, knowing that those to whom they had gifted them could possess them only by fighting for them. History answers. The popes. Who deposed sovereigns and sanctioned insurrection and war between them and their subjects? The popes. Who so often tempted the Swiss from their mountains to shed their blood on the plains of Italy? The Bishop of Sion, acting as the legate of the Pope. Who was it that, the better to maintain the predominance of their own sway, kept Italy divided, at the cost of almost ceaseless intestine feuds and wars, and the leaving of the gates of the country unguarded, or purposely open, for the entrance of foreign hordes? History answers. The popes. Who was it that, having entered into war with France, threw aside the mitre for the helmet, and passing over a bridge on the Tiber, is said to have thrown down the keys of St. Peter into the river, seeing they had served him so ill, and called for the sword of St. Paul? Pope Julius II, who organized the successive campaigns waged against the Hussites, and on 2 several occasions sent his legata latere to lead the Crusaders. History answers. The Pope. We stop at the era of the Reformation. We put no questions to history touching the wars in Germany, the wars in France, the wars in the Low Countries, the wars in Hungary, and in other lands in which, too, the blood of the scaffold was largely mingled with the blood of the battlefield. We restrict our examples to those ages when Rome was not only a power, but the power in Christendom. Kings were then her vassals, and she had only to speak to be obeyed. Why then did she not summon them to her bar, and command them to sheathe their swords? Why did she not bind them in the chain of her excommunications, and compel them to be at peace until she had arbitrated in their quarrels, and so prevent this great effusion of human blood? Here are the Pope's exploits on the field of war. Why has history forgotten to chronicle his labors and sacrifices in the blessed work of peace? True, we do find a few outstanding instances of the popes enjoining peace among Christian princes. We find the Council of Lyon, 1245, ordaining a general cessation of arms amongst the Western sovereigns, with power to prelates to proceed by censure against those who refused to acquiesce. But for what end? In order that the crusade which had been projected might be carried out with greater unanimity and vigor. We find Gregory X sending his nuncio to compel observance to this decree in the Council on Philip III of France, and the King of Castile, knowing that these two sovereigns were about to decide a certain difference by arms, because he needed their swords to fight his own battles. We find further Boniface VIII enjoining all sovereigns to terminate all wars and differences at home, that they might be in circumstances to prosecute more vigorously the holy wars of the Church. These and a few similar instances are all that we have on the one side to set over against the long roll of melancholy facts on the other. History's verdict is that with the ascent of the popes to the supremacy came not peace, but war to Christendom. The noon of the papal power was illustrated not by its calm splendor and its tranquil joys, but by its tempest and battle of destruction. It's time for a break. I'll be back in a few minutes.